Good evening, everybody. How are you guys all doing? Good evening to you too, Colby. I heard you. All right, how is everybody doing tonight? Wow, we have a lot of people here. All right, I want to quickly introduce myself. I'm Katie, one of the youth interns here at Life Church. And in case you don't know who I am, I know I've only been here for 8 months, but there's still quite a few of you whose faces I don't recognize and stuff like that. So even if you're new here or if you've been coming for a while, I would still love to have the opportunity to meet you later on after small groups. So currently we are in a 3-week series called Judgment Call. And the reason for this is that on a day-to-day basis, we're constantly presented with making different calls. And so most of the time we find ourselves answering the question, well, which option is better? And we weigh both sides and we try and figure out, like, do we chew that bubble gum or do we actually brush our teeth before going to school? We're constantly presented with these different types of judgment calls. And especially when it comes to making judgment calls, most of the time our personal preferences end up weighing and winning that argument. So whatever we prefer in that moment or feel, that's generally what we end up going with. And that is true especially when it comes to one another. And so last week, Dan kicked off our series and he talked about our only option when it comes to judging others is to drop that rock. And he even had a couple of rocks up here. And the reason for that is because it's God's job to judge other people, not yours. And this week we're talking about how it's not good to be labeling one another a lost cause. It's better to believe in God's potential and what God is doing. And that's because the right judgment call when it comes to one another is to believe the best and trust God with the rest of it. We all make these judgments on a day-to-day basis without all of the facts. And we think we know that other person, or we think that we have all the right answers to our questions, when in reality, we're actually still missing the bigger picture. And if you believe it or not, you and I in this room, we are not the first ones to judge one another. We are not the first ones to assume that we know the whole story, because quite often we all end up judging one another kind of like books. We all kind of judge books based on their covers, and we do the same thing to one another and those around us. So a few years ago, actually I think it's more than a few years ago now, there was a single mother, and her name was Joanne. And Joanne, she had hit rock bottom, and her daughter were living from welfare check to welfare check, and that's how they lived. Joanne was alone, she was depressed, and on top of it, she had no money and she was completely broke. Joanne had been working on a project for over 7 years, and that's how she lived for that entire time. Her and her daughter lived welfare check to welfare check. And finally, after 7 years, her project was complete, and it was actually a manuscript. And so she took this manuscript to publisher after publisher after publisher. And now Joanne's manuscript was actually rejected not just one time, but 12 times, which if you could imagine, like the heartbreak after working on this project for so long and to have it rejected so often. But that's what happened to Joanne. And finally, the 13th publisher took a chance on Joanne. The publisher paid her $4,000 to publish her manuscript, and they agreed to print only 1,000 copies of it. 500 of the copies would immediately go to public libraries, and the other 500 would be put on the market for sale. Today, Joanne's book has now sold over 400 million copies, and Joanne is actually worth more than $1 billion herself. You know Joanne's manuscript today as Harry Potter, and so Joanne is obviously J.K. Rowling. And today, Joanne is now literally richer than the Queen of England. But in the beginning, nobody believed in her. She came out of nowhere. And when those 500 copies were first put on the market, nobody was waiting with bated breath for them to be sold, and nobody was lining up to receive her signature. Now those 500 copies are worth more than $42,000 each. That's a lot of money. But at the beginning, nobody believed in her. Nobody even wanted to check those books out of the library. And I find it kind of funny that I'm actually standing up here sharing about J.K. Rowling, and honestly, I actually haven't read her books ever. And before you judge me, I was totally homeschooled my whole entire life, so that might have a little bit to do with it. So I was just sheltered only a little bit. And so now, I'm not a publisher. I've never worked for a publishing company, but what I think happened with those first 12 publishers is that they took a look at the cover of Joanne's book and judged what was on the inside based on what was on the outside. They looked at it and said, this doesn't look like much good on the outside. There's probably not that much good on the inside. And honestly, if you think about it from the publisher's perspective, that actually makes a lot of sense, because they get thousands upon thousands upon thousands of hopeful entries from writers, hoping for their one big break. So to them, Joanne was just another one of those hopeful people. Those publishers had seen it a million times, and Joanne Rowling was just one more. And there was no reason to believe that she would be any different than anyone else. But what those 12 publishers didn't know was that they were all wrong. The problem was those publishers couldn't see the future based on what was in front of them. They couldn't see the potential in Joanne's manuscript. And we all do the same thing to one another. We look at the people around us and we don't see what they can be. We simply just see them for who they are right now. Our instinct is to look at one another and we look at somebody's outward behavior and we make an assumption about who they are and who they're going to be. We look at them and say, because you are that way right now, you're always going to be that way, and you're never going to be anything different. And we do this not even intentionally sometimes. Quite often we make these very quick snap judgments about one another, and we do it without thinking sometimes. But we do it without knowing the whole story. And that's because our perception is skewed because of these labels, kind of like how we played tonight. We place labels on one another. And just like those publishers thought about Joanne, we think we've seen this manuscript a million times over. And this time it just has a different cover. So we see that guy in our class who plays football, and we think that they only ever care about just sports and nothing else. Or we see that guy or that girl who is constantly reading a book on the bus or who studies too much, and we think that's all that they're ever going to do. Or we have that group in our school who parties too much, and we think that's all they care about is being popular. Or there's that group who never seems to party, and we wonder all they're going to do is just be nerds all day long. But we do this not just to one another, but we also do this to ourselves as well. We place labels on ourselves, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally. And I know this to be true because I myself have placed many, many labels on myself. In fact, my sophomore year of college, I received a 16 out of 100 on a chemistry test. Not just once, but multiple times. Yeah, I know, it's really low. And because of that, I ended up labeling myself a failure. I told myself that I would never amount to much. I would never end up doing much with my life or going that many places. So I told myself that I was never going to be much more than just a failure. Or maybe you play soccer or you play on the track team and you think I'm never going to be much more than just a jock. Or maybe there was a really bad or rude Snapchat that was sent throughout the whole school, and you think all I'm ever going to have is this bad reputation. And I wish it was as easy as me standing up here and telling you, well, just stop saying those things, or stop thinking those things about one another. But it really isn't that easy, is it? Because you see, change happens when you believe something different. Change happens when you stop believing in who you're telling yourself that you just are. Because I'm not just a failure, and that boy in your class, he isn't just a jock. And that girl who has the bad video, she isn't going to always have that bad reputation. Because the truth is, God doesn't see you and I as just anything. He doesn't look at us and say, oh, look, there goes just another human. He doesn't. He doesn't look at us that way. And the sooner you and I stop believing those damaging lies and those damaging labels, and we stop judging one another, the sooner you can start believing the best about others and trusting God with the rest of it. Because these judgments are all based on what we see. And that's backed up in the Bible. In Matthew 7:24, it says to stop judging by mere appearances. And that's because that's what we do. We look at a person or we look at our own actions and we judge them based on what's going on. And honestly, it's way easier sometimes. It's hard to believe the best and to trust God with the rest of it. It's hard to make that right judgment call because the right call is usually the one that's harder. But you're not the only one. You see, for thousands and thousands of years, people have been judging one another. People for thousands of years have been put in the same situation you and I are in right now, where they're weighing both options and they're saying, am I going to judge them based on what I see, or am I going to assume the best and trust God with the rest of it? The passage of scripture that we're going to be looking from today and reading from is in the book of Joshua, which is in the Old Testament, and the main character of the story is Rahab. And so you see, Rahab comes into contact with a group, or not a group, just a couple of Israelite men, and they are spying in her country. And these Israelite men are what we call foreigners. They look differently, they smell differently, and they talk differently. And so before I dive into the passage of Scripture, I just want to give a quick background on who the Israelites are and why they're even in Rahab's country. So the leader of the Israelites is Joshua, and that's probably why he has the Bible named after him. Just saying, you don't get that for doing nothing. And so Joshua was the successor to Moses. And if you don't know or if you don't remember, Moses was the guy who was instructed by God to lead his people out of slavery in Egypt. He was told to take them out of this slavery and bring them to this promised land. So after 40 years, the Israelites have been wandering around in the wilderness, and they finally make it to the promised land named Jericho. But when they get there, they realize that this land is already inhabited, and there's even a king who's already ruling over these people. And so that's where we pick up the story. We see Joshua has sent spies into the land, and these spies are now taking refuge in Rahab's house. And so if you start reading in Joshua 2, and we're going to look at verses 2 through 5, and I believe it's going to be up on the screen too. And so we start reading in verse 2. But someone told the king of Jericho, some Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent orders to Rahab, bring out the men who have come into your house, for they have come here to spy out the whole land. But Rahab had hidden the two men, and she replied to them, yes, the men were here earlier, but I don't know where they are from. They left the town at dusk as the gates were about to close. I don't know where they went. If you hurry, you can probably catch up with them. So we see immediately that Rahab has already made a decision. She's already made the decision to assume the best about these men and trust God with the rest of it. And we know that to be true because she's taking God's side in this story. She's choosing to lie to the king's men and to deceive them about where the men are. And so that's a sign that she's chosen that option. Rahab hid the spies. She was on God's side. She was outsmarting her own king. And honestly, that's a pretty awesome person if you ask me. Not many of us are willing to stand up for what's right. Rahab was on God's side, helping God's chosen people, who were the Israelites. But the story doesn't end there. If we back up to verse 1 of chapter 2, you'll read this. Joshua sent out spies from the Israelite camp at Acacia Grove. He instructed them, scout out the land on the other side of the Jordan River, especially around Jericho. So the two men set out and came to the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there the night. Did you catch that last line of the verse? Did you catch what Rahab's label was? You see, Rahab was a prostitute. She had committed sin like all of us. And that's really not the type of person that you would expect to be a hero in God's story. Yet God had chosen Rahab. He had chosen her to play this vital role and to have a pivotal role in the Israelites winning. So in this story, Rahab isn't the only one who is choosing to assume the best about other people. So through this story, we see that God is also showing us exactly how to believe the best. Because God doesn't ask you and I to do anything that he isn't first willing to do. Because just like you and I, Rahab had free will. She had the option to do what she wanted to do. So she could have chosen to not hide those men. She could have chosen to tell those guards and those soldiers the truth about where the men were. But she didn't. God had believed the best about what Rahab was going to do, and he chose not to judge her based on her label. God saw past her current sin. He saw her potential, and he believed in her. And he does the very same thing for you and I. So if the creator of the universe, the one who even created us, looks past our labels, shouldn't we be doing the same thing? Because the truth is that when it comes to one another, we need to be assuming the best and trusting God with the rest of it. Rahab's story still doesn't even end there. If you read on in the book of Joshua, you'll see that she saved her entire family and played a very, very pivotal role in the Israelites taking over Jericho. And now if we skip over to the New Testament of the Bible, over to a book called Matthew, we'll find there a long list of names. And honestly, I'm one of those kinds of people who gets to those passage of scriptures and kind of like skips over them. I'm just like, and moving on. But if you pay attention to these names, I've learned through like my years of reading the Bible that these names are actually important, and they're in the Bible for a very specific reason. So if we look at Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, we see this list of names. And this list of names is Jesus' family tree. So it's as if we were looking up a list of names of who your grandparents were and who your aunts and your uncles and all of them are. That's what we're looking at here. And so in Matthew 1, verse 5, we see this. It says, Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. So did you catch that part? Do you remember who I said Rahab was? What Rahab's label was? Right, Rahab was a prostitute. God directly put a prostitute in Jesus' family line. God doesn't make any accidents. He doesn't make any oversights. So what he is doing in this verse right here, he's making a very, very clear point. He is much interested in much more than just how we appear. God doesn't make judgment calls based on what he sees. God sees our potential. He sees a future bigger than any of us could imagine, even for those of us who think it's not possible for me. God doesn't need perfect people to accomplish his perfect plan. He's not looking for people who are free of sin to accomplish his perfect plan. God uses broken people. He uses people who are righteous and sinful. He uses people who have great influence in this world, and also those of us who feel powerless. And he uses all of those types of people to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And we forget that quite often. We see an unruly or an immoral behavior, we see a poor choice or a bad decision, and we label one another based on those things. And no matter how well we know them, we can't see what will happen when God enters their story. And you don't have to be a Christian or even somebody who comes to church every week or even to 621 often. But you can already see how judging one another is harmful. And it's not just harmful to us, it's harmful to the people that we place judgments on. Because ultimately, the judgments you make affect how you treat other people. Because the thing that you believe about others spills out into your judgments, and ultimately, it affects the way that you treat them. And so I know, as I said earlier, making judgment calls and judging one another, it's a very hard habit to break. And so what I want to give to you guys tonight is just a couple of tools for the next time you feel like you're judging someone. Because you do have a choice. You're not powerless in your judgment. But ultimately, it's up to you to make that call. So you can start tonight here at 621. Because even though we might not want to believe it, we do judge one another here. So you can start tonight with the people that you might be most likely to judge. And then when you wake up tomorrow, you can carry these things over into school with you. So I just have two things for you to remember. The first one is to assume the best, because not all judgments are negative. Even the people you disagree with, still assume the best in them. Assumptions can sometimes be good, and there is more to the story than what you can see or what you know right now. Because God hasn't written that person off, so neither should you. There's more to that person than their current actions, and just like Rahab, there's more to the story that you cannot see. And honestly, you'll also be happier if you start to assume the best about the people around you. If you start to assume that everyone around you is just simply trying to do their very best. And chances are, as a result of assuming the best in them, you'll end up treating them better as well. So that was number one, to assume the best. And the second one is to trust God with the rest. There is a 100% chance that if you assume the best, somebody will still end up letting you down. It's going to happen. There is a 100% chance that their actions and their decisions will not line up with yours or your opinions. And when this happens, because it will happen, resist the temptation to point a finger and say, "See, I told you, I knew that you were always going to be that way." Resist making that judgment call. And just like Dan said last week, judging their actions isn't your job. It's God's job. Their story isn't over yet. And even if their actions don't line up with yours, you have no idea what their future looks like. So trust God with their future. Trust that God knows more than you do, which, by the way, He really does know more than you do. And these two things, assuming the best and trusting God with the rest, they also apply to you and how you view yourself. Because just like others, there are always things going on the inside of you that you might not understand. And God doesn't do to you what those publishers did to Joanne. God doesn't look at a book and judge it based on its cover. And that's because He doesn't have to. God is fortunate enough to be able to look at our hearts and what our hearts are really trying to accomplish. 1 Samuel 16:7, in the later half of the verse, it says, "The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart." God looks at your heart. He knows what's going on the inside. And so because he knows the whole story, he doesn't have to see us the way we see one another. So because God knows these things about each other and about us, it might be a good idea if you start praying to have eyes like God. If you start praying to see others and see yourself the way that God sees you and the way that God looks at others. And while we do that, we have to trust that he is at work in their story as much as he is at work in our own story. So tonight, as we wrap up, I want you guys to think about the people you are most likely to judge, because we all do judge one another. What kinds of categories do you put them in? What assumptions do you make about their future? And what would it look like tonight if starting tonight at 6:21, you were able to take that switch in your mind and flip it? What if you flipped that switch and you started to assume the best about that person? What if you started to assume that they're just simply doing the best that they can, and then trust that God is at work in their life? Because remember, whether or not they're a good or a bad person is not your call. Your call is simply to assume the best and to trust God with the rest of it.